Good morning, y'all. It's good to be back with you this morning for the second lesson in our study of the book of Hebrews. Last week, we started our study off with an introduction to the book of Hebrews. But as I told you last week, before we really begin to dive into the text of Hebrews itself, we're going to spend several weeks examining and thinking about some Old Testament and Judaic ideas and concepts that really provide some of the theological foundations for the book of Hebrews. As people living under a different covenant and a different law, it can be hard for us to sometimes understand fully some of the things that Hebrews is talking about. The reality is that the message of Hebrews was written almost two millennia ago in the Greek language by an educated person of Jewish descent in the form of a synagogue sermon and for a church that was located in a Greco-Roman culture. To say the least, this message is packed in strange wrappings and lies on the far side of a wide cultural and linguistic divide from us. For this very reason, I want us to spend the next 3 weeks trying to build a bridge, even if it's a kind of rickety one, because we don't have time to dive as fully into these ideas as we would like to. But still try to build a bridge across this cultural and linguistic and theological divide. I want us to step back and reflect upon the ideas of Hebrews. These ideas that will hopefully better equip us to study Hebrews. The ideas of priesthood, sacrifice, and covenant. And so this morning we turn our attention to the first of those ideas, the idea of priesthood. The term priest appears some 36 times in 33 verses throughout the book of Hebrews. It first appears rather briefly in chapter 2, again quickly in chapter 3, and most prominently in chapters 7 through 9. But it's also found in chapters 4, 5, 6, 10, and 13. This idea of the priesthood, or of priests, is clearly sprinkled throughout the book of Hebrews, even if there are some sections where it is certainly the largest idea. Now, in the context of Hebrews, the bulk of this discussion about what it means and looks like to be a priest will revolve around the discussion of Jesus as our new high priest. The idea of Jesus as our new high priest, which of course is the subject of a brief dialogue in Hebrews 4:14 through about chapter 5 and verse 10, but is the main focus of a much larger extended treatise in Hebrews 7, 8, and 9. In this regard, then, a sizable chunk of the book of Hebrews is contingent upon us having an understanding of the priesthood, and especially the high priest. If we're going to understand what the author means when he says that Jesus is our new high priest, one who sympathizes with us, one who is different from the high priest of the line of Aaron because he is a high priest of the order of Melchizedek, then we need to understand a little something about being a high priest. All of these things that are discussed about Jesus as the new high priest, we're going to discuss in more detail in their time. But my point in all of this for now, in bringing our attention to these ideas, is just to say this. If we're going to study Hebrews, we need to understand the priesthood as a concept. Until we understand the high priesthood of Aaron, we will never understand why it matters that Jesus was superior to him as our new high priest. Until we understand the function of a high priest, we will never understand why it is important that the high priest be able to sympathize with us. Until we understand the role of the priest in bringing about and bridging the divide between God and man, we will never understand why it matters that Jesus becomes the high priest once and for all. These are fundamental and foundational ideas to the study of Hebrews. Well, with that in mind, we turn our attention to the text that I assigned as our reading for class today. In Exodus 28, and there in verse 1, we're introduced for the first time to the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood. In verse 1 there, God speaking to Moses says, "Then bring near to you Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the people of Israel to serve me as priests. Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar." We see that God in this moment chooses and designates a line of priests. They are to be the family of Aaron, Moses' older brother and right-hand man. As part of this, we also see that the priesthood, by virtue of being tied to the family of Aaron, is going to be part of the broader tribe of Levi. That God, in choosing and assigning portions of land and responsibilities and blessing the 12 tribes of Israel, is going to single out the tribe of Levi for this particular task. The line of the high priest was hereditary. It followed Aaron and his sons. But the priesthood on the whole, it was much larger, encompassing the entire Levitical clan. And so in this regard, we see that here in Exodus 28, for the first time, God designates from here on out a group to be his priests. Priests existed before this. Exodus 28 isn't the first time we see that term. But this marks a fundamental turning point. When God chooses a part of the family, a part of Israel, to be the priests of his tabernacle and then his temple. In this text, we see in chapters 28 and 29 that after providing instructions for the tabernacle, the place where God would dwell with his people, God then turns his attention toward the instructions for the priests. Those servants of God who were to minister at the tabernacle on behalf of the people. In chapter 28, as we read on through, we see that God provides instructions for the clothes that they were to wear. And they were to separate, these clothes were designed to separate them, to indicate the nature of their special calling and task. In chapter 29, we find that God further instructs Moses to consecrate Aaron and his sons. Consecration means to make them holy through purification, because their job was to enter into the presence of God on behalf of the people. God literally dwelt with his people in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was sacred and holy not because of what it was made out of, but because it was God who dwelt there. And for these priests to serve at the tabernacle, for the high priest to be able to enter into the Holy of Holies, they had to be holy. Because where God is holy ground. And God says they need to be consecrated. They need to be set aside. They need to be made pure. They need to be made holy. And that can only come through my action. Exodus 29 ends this way. Starting there in verse 45, or 44 rather. God says, I will consecrate the tent of meeting in the altar. Aaron also and his sons I will consecrate to serve me as priests. I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God. And they shall know that I am the Lord their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am the Lord their God. Chapter 29, in this discussion about the consecration of the priests, ends with God bringing it all full circle. He says, I need these priests who are going to serve me and serve the people as my mediators between them and me. I need them, and I'm going to consecrate them. But all of this is part of God's bigger plan to remind the people of Israel that He was going to dwell with them, that He was going to be their God. In this, God reaffirms that covenant promise to dwell with Israel and be their God. And so if the priesthood is established here in Exodus 28 and 29, the question is, what exactly did they do? And why does it matter? Well, the functions of the priesthood in the Old Testament were really threefold. First, they were to be mediators between the holy God of the universe and the sinful people of Israel. They were the ones who would go between God and man. Second, they were to teach the instruction of God to the sons of Israel. It was their job to be the ones who instructed Israel in the ways to be faithful, in the ways to follow God. And then finally, they were responsible for facilitating the worship of God in an appropriate manner. They presided over the sacrifices and the worship services and the ceremonies. They were the ones who were responsible for ensuring that God was worshiped in a way that was pleasing and acceptable. These are all very significant and important tasks. And so in the Old Testament then, when we talk about priests, we are talking about the officers of God whose job it was to be intermediaries between God and the people. To be the ones who went before God on behalf of the people. Who bridged the gap between the holy God and the sinful people. And in doing so, who helped bring the people into a right relationship with the holy God because of God's offer for holiness and forgiveness being extended. Priests sprinkled blood of purification on the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, the altars, the Ark itself, and on those with designated plagues. They prepared and burned incense on the inner altar. They lit the candelabra and offered advice to the people on religious matters. They performed elaborate rituals of sacrifice, instructed the people, judged certain cases, particularly cases involving temple matters. They blessed the nation. They examined and purified lepers, and they helped the high priest in teaching the oracles of the Lord that were entrusted to him. The priests carried out so many different aspects of life in Israelite society. Yet the most significant of these jobs were those that pertained to ensuring Israel stayed in a right relationship with God through the carrying out of sacrifices and purification. Under the system of sacrifice, which we'll talk in more depth about next week, it was vital that sacrifice be a continual process. It was something that had to keep being done. Sins had to regularly be atoned for. If they were not, then it was impossible for the children of Israel to be in a right relationship with God. And so when we think about the job of the priests, it was their job to make sure that the people were in a right relationship with God. Y'all, that's significant. But as such, the priests had very strict codes of conduct that were placed upon them. You could not have unholy priests serving and worshiping a holy God. Their genealogy was to remain in the line of Aaron in the tribe of Levi. There were restrictions placed upon them with regard to who they could or could not marry. The priests had to be consecrated and must maintain their own standards of purity and obedience. The reality is that an unholy or impure priest could not enter the presence of a holy God. And if the priests could not enter the presence of God, they were useless for the one task they were responsible for carrying out more than any other. In this regard, then, priests played a critical role in Israelite society. Without the intermediary work of the priests, it was impossible for the people to have a relationship with God. It was the priest who provided over their sacrifices. It was the priest who affirmed their purification. It was the priest who led their worship. And if the priest did not do their job, then the people could not carry out the necessary sacrifices and the necessary rituals to stay in a right relationship with God. Folks, priests played a critically important role. Even more important than the priesthood generally defined, though, was the high priest. The high priest was the foremost priest of Israel. He had special duties and even more stringent regulations placed upon him. One of the first things that distinguishes the high priest from all the other priests was the character and conduct to which he was held. Certainly we know that the office of the high priest was hereditary. It was passed from father to oldest son, from Aaron down through the line. So we know that during this period, the high priest, it was already determined who it was going to be. But nevertheless, even though it was hereditary, its holder still had to be without physical defect, as well as being holy in conduct. In Leviticus chapter 21, and there, beginning there in verse 6, we find these words. Speaking of the high priest, he says, "They shall be holy to their God, and not profane the name of their God. For they offer the Lord's food offerings, the bread of their God. Therefore they shall be holy. They shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who has been defiled. Neither shall they marry a woman divorced from her husband, for the priest is holy to his God. You shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. And the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself, by whoring profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. The priest who is chief among his brothers, on whose head the anointing oil is poured, and who has been consecrated to wear garments, shall not let the hair of his head hang loose, nor tear his clothes. He shall not go into any dead bodies, or make himself unclean, even for his father or mother. And we could continue reading here in Leviticus chapter 21 about all of these regulations. But what we see is that the high priest had strict regulations. He was not allowed to show grief for the dead, even his mother or father, by removing his headdress or letting his hair be unkempt. He could not tear his clothes in grief, nor go near a dead body. Leaving his duties unperformed because of a death, according to Leviticus 21 and verse 12, would profane the sanctuary. If we keep reading there in Leviticus 21, we see that he could only marry a virgin of his own people. She could not be a widow, a divorced woman, or an impure woman. The high priest must not, by a bad marriage, spoil his own holiness or endanger the holiness of the son who would succeed him, because he was the holiness of God. Notice again what it says there in verse 8. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. The high priest of Israel became the holiness of God for the people of Israel. And when you are the holiness of God on behalf of the people, that cannot be endangered or risked. Additionally, the high priest had to be consecrated and made holy before he could officially begin his service, as we saw in Exodus 29. This was an elaborate 7-day service at the tabernacle, or the temple, as we read about in Exodus 29. During that process, sacrifices of sin offerings, burnt offerings, and consecration offerings were made for the high priest. He was anointed with oil and the blood of the sacrifice, and thus, having been sanctified to serve as priest and consecrated to offer the sacrifice, he became the Holy One of the Lord, as we see the high priest described in Psalm 106 and verse 16. And so in light of this, in light of the holiness and consecration of the high priest, all of these things were necessary because of the job that God had ordained him to do. While the high priest had a number of responsibilities, the most important responsibility of all was to conduct the service on the Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month each year. On this day, he and he alone entered the holy place behind the veil before God. He literally entered into the dwelling place of God himself. He wasn't just in the building anymore. Now he's in the room with God. And having made sacrifice for himself first and then for the people, he brought the blood of atonement through the sacrifice into the Holy of Holies, and he sprinkled it on the mercy seat of God, of the ark, God's literal throne. And in doing so, he offered the blood sacrifice on behalf of himself and the people that would lead to the atoning of the sins of Israel, so that all of the sins that he himself and the people had committed during the year would be atoned for. In this regard, it was the high priest who solely became the mediator between God and man for their sins. This is a critical role, and one that came with the most serious responsibility and consequences. Without the high priest, there was no path for sins to be atoned. The people would remain saddled with the guilt of their transgressions. Well, I don't think I have to spell out for you all of the comparisons that abound through this discussion of the priesthood in Jesus. And certainly we're not going to do that today. We'll save those conversations in more detail when we get to the appropriate places in the text of Hebrews where we talk about those ideas. But as we think about the priesthood, there are a couple of takeaways that I think we need to be mindful of. When we think about what it meant to be a priest in the Old Testament, it meant someone who was made holy. They had to be holy and pure and righteous. And that holiness and purity and righteousness came from God and God alone. But it was important that once God had consecrated them, they maintained their holiness. Because, number two, their job was to be a go-between, a mediator between God and man. And by virtue of being the mediator between God and man, and the high priest especially, they had to be holy to enter the presence of a holy God. Additionally, by virtue of being mediators, their job was to ensure that the people of God stayed in a right relationship with God. They were the ones who offered the sacrifices, who led worship, who made it possible for the people to access the mercy of God. Now, do not misunderstand me. It was not the high priest who made the people holy. It was not the high priest who took away sin. That was God and God alone. But it was the high priest who brought them that access. Any everyday, ordinary Israelite could not have entered the presence of God to offer the blood sacrifice on the Day of Atonement. It was the high priest and the high priest alone who could do that. In this regard, when we think about the role of priests, it is the priest, and especially the high priest, though, who allow and who make it possible for the people to access God. The priests were the bridge between God and man, who were able to, with the blood of the sacrifice, help the people span the gulf of sin and be made and brought into a right relationship with God. These ideas, then, about the job and the function and the role of priests are critical for us to understand Hebrews. Because until we understand what it meant to be a priest, why the high priest was so important, we will never understand exactly why it matters that Jesus is now our high priest, or how he is a better one than any of the priests of Aaron. But it's also important, as part of this conversation, that we understand exactly what it was that these priests were doing in offering sacrifices, and why these sacrifices mattered so much, and what exactly it meant that sins could be atoned for, or why blood had to be offered and shed for the atoning of sins. Because all of that is also part of the story. But that will have to wait until next week. Y'all have a great week, and may God bless you in all your efforts to be His light and His glory wherever you are.